His 42 years in power have made him one of the longest ruling leaders in history. To be precise, he is the longest-serving head of government, while the fourth longest person to have served as head of state. Gaddafi has a network of informants spread throughout the country in all walks of life, government, factories, education, etc. It is also a fact that Libya is the most censored country in the Middle East and North Africa, according to the Freedom of the Press Index. In fact, according to the index, Libya is ranked the fourth most censored country in the world. His rule has been one of oppression and violence. It is illegal to speak with foreigners regarding political matters, and if caught doing so, punishable by 3 years in prison, although it is difficult for his countrymen to do so given that foreign languages are no longer taught in schools. In order to further subjugate and terrorize his people, dissidents are publicly executed, and then the state television channel broadcasts the execution. Prisons in Libya are not a good place to end up, as there is little, if any, documentation regarding the inmates. Such basic information as the crime or the sentence is rarely ever found. More commonly known as Colonel Gaddafi, there are approximately 37 different spellings for his name. Gaddafi was born on June 7, 1942, in a desert area known as Sirte. He was the youngest child of a Bedouin family and lived a nomadic life for the early part of his youth. His father, who died in 1985, was known as Abu Meniar, and his mother's name is Aisha Gaddafi. When he was younger, his friends would call him Al-Jamil, or the Handsome. His early education was that of a traditional Muslim education. From 1956 to 1961, Gaddafi attended the Sebha Preparatory School in Fezzan. The friendships that he would form here would eventually be the basis for the core leadership of the revolutionary group that would go on to take control of Libya. Gaddafi cited as his inspiration Gamal Abdel Nasser, president of Egypt. Nasser would become president of Egypt by appealing to Arab nationalism. Gaddafi was expelled in 1961 from Sebha because of his political beliefs. Admission to the military academy and a career in the army in Libya, like many other Arab countries, was available to members of the lower classes after the country had obtained independence. Military careers were good opportunities for higher education and the ability to improve socially and economically. A military career also afforded many Libyans the opportunity to act upon their political beliefs.
It's serving a nation. There's no jobs, 20–30% unemployment. Traditionally, there haven't been a lot of jobs in Libya. This has provided an outlet for the young men. You know, because as you know, if you don't have a job, you can't get a dowry, you can't marry. It's terrible.
Graduating with high grades from the University of Libya with a degree in law, Gaddafi would go on to enter the Libyan Military Academy in Benghazi in 1963. It was here that he and a few of his friends would form the Free Officers Movement, a militant secret group dedicated to overthrowing the pro-Western Libyan monarchy. The desire to overthrow the monarchy was fueled by Israel's decisive and humiliating defeat of the Arabs in 1967. He was sent to Britain after graduation in 1965 for further training at what was then the British Army Staff College, now called the Joint Services Command and Staff College. Gaddafi returned to Libya in 1966 as a commissioned officer in the Signal Corps. In 1959, Libya was considered to be one of the poorest countries in the world. The discovery of massive oil reserves changed all that. The money from the oil significantly improved finances for the government and for the royal family. They, however, were the only ones to actually benefit from the oil discovery.
Gaddafi came to power because there had been a ruling family who had basically made deals with oil companies, very good deals for the oil companies, very bad deal for Libya, to sell the oil that was being developed in Libya. And Gaddafi basically came to power as a revolutionary, as a military officer who was a revolutionary, who was going to throw out this old regime that was not spreading the wealth, not sharing the wealth with the people.
Increasing resentment towards the monarchy as their wealth continued to increase, combined with the shame at the Arab world's crushing defeat by the Israelis, gave the Free Officers movement incentive to overthrow the monarchy. Gaddafi and his 70-some conspirators made their move on September 1, 1969, when they overthrew King Idris. The bloodless coup was executed while the king was in Greece for medical treatment. He was to have abdicated the throne on September 2nd so that his nephew, Prince Hassan as-Sanusi, could be crowned. But before the day was out, the monarchy had been abolished and the crown prince placed under house arrest. The Libyan Arab Republic was born.
Well, when he overthrew King Idris, he saw himself as a revolutionary. Remember, this was in the 70s. I guess he even thought he was like Abdul Nasser to a certain extent. And he had this form of Arab nationalism. Gaddafi talked about Arab African nationalism. He's always talked about maybe Libya becoming the leader of a continental-wide African confederation with him at the leadership.
In a mere 2 hours, the coup was quickly backed by the army, and within a few days had successfully established military control throughout the country. Overall, the change in leadership was greeted with enthusiasm, especially by the younger generation living in the larger cities. Reportedly, there were no deaths or violence associated with the coup. Although the British had planned to work with some mercenaries to help overthrow Gaddafi and place the monarchy back in power, they ended up not doing so because it was felt that Gaddafi was anti-communist enough to be acceptable. As it was, King Idris had publicly called for support of the new regime and even went so far as to distance himself from the plot to overthrow Gaddafi. He was subsequently assured that his family was safe. At his request, and with the approval of President Nasser, Idris moved to Egypt, where he lived until his death. Gaddafi is unique among the other military leaders who have successfully overthrown the existing government. He had been a captain prior to the coup, but afterwards only accepted a ceremonial promotion to colonel, which he has maintained throughout his rule. His reasoning for this is simple. He states that Libya is ruled by the people so that he does not need fancy titles or high military ranks. The Free Officers movement was responsible for the coup against the Libyan monarchy. However, there was a group within the movement that called itself the Revolutionary Command Council, or RCC. The group consisted of 12 members that would eventually comprise the new Libyan government. RCC released a statement on September 1st that declared Libya to be a free and sovereign state, now called the Libyan Arab Republic. This state would proceed in the path of freedom, unity, and social justice, guaranteeing the right of equality to its citizens and opening before them the doors of honorable work. The previous regime was likened to living in the Dark Ages, and Libyans were called to begin the process as free brothers to create a new age of prosperity, equality, and honor.
Gaddafi got into power because he used the very means of the dissatisfaction with King Idris in the use of oil wealth. And ironically, he's using the same oil wealth for his achievement as well. He hasn't really done much in terms of society. His socialist programs that he's talked about haven't really benefited all of society. They've tended to benefit his family and his immediate allies. So his removal was basically, he came into power to remove a corrupt leader, and that corrupt leader eventually became him.
And at the time that he came into control, Libya did not have a long history of independence, and he is essentially the person that has created the state of Libya as it exists today, insofar as it unites three previously disparate sort of provinces that had all been united as a result of their colonial experience, and draws them together with some, at least, institutions of modern statehood.
In the final months of 1969, the RCC implemented domestic reforms and abolished all parliamentary institutions. All legislative functions were now controlled by the RCC. The law banning other political parties that had been in effect since 1952 was allowed to continue. In addition, RCC made clear that Libya was part of the Arab nation and that Islam was the state religion. One of the reasons for the rejection of communism was actually because communism is predominantly atheistic. Its official platform was that of an Arab view of socialism that allowed for the integration of Islamic principles while creating social, economic, and political reform. Another important issue was the vocalization of support for Palestine in their fight against Israel. Gaddafi took Libya from one of the traditional conservative states and changed it to that of a radical Arabian nation. Members of the RCC assured Libyans that the new government would not be run by a sole individual, but by a group as a whole. In spite of this, it was apparent early on that Gaddafi acted more like a dictator, with the RCC supporting his every decision. Subsequently, Gaddafi, in addition to acting as chairman of the RCC, added the duties of prime minister and defense minister. His second in command was Major Abdel Salam Jaloud, who had now the titles of deputy prime minister and minister of interior. There were now 13 members in the cabinet, of whom only 5 were RCC officers. RCC had stated from the beginning that they planned to hold the previous government accountable. So beginning in 1971 through 1972, over 200 former government officials, including the former king and members of his family, were tried on charges of treason and corruption by the Libyan People's Court. Many of the cases were tried in absentia. The majority of those charged were acquitted. However, others were not so lucky. Many others received sentences up to 15 years in prison. Others received heavy fines. There were even 5 death sentences, with all but one in absentia. Idris was one of those who received a death sentence. His wife, Fatima, was sentenced to 5 years in prison. In October of 1970, Gaddafi expelled any remaining Italians and Jews from Libya. Their property was then confiscated. Egypt continued to be an inspiration for Libya. In 1971, the Free Officers Movement was renamed the Arab Socialist Union, or ASU, after Egypt's Arab Socialist Union. It was then made the only party allowed in Libya. The ASU was to be a vehicle of national expression and to be used to raise the political awareness of Libyans. Strikes were officially outlawed in Libya after trade unions were incorporated into the ASU. The press had been censored for years, and in 1972 officially became a part of the revolution. According to the Freedom of the Press Index, Libya became the most censored country in the Middle East and North Africa, where it remains to this day. The United States had forces stationed at the Wheelus Air Base in Libya during the coup. They began withdrawing their troops, and the last of the Americans turned the base over to the Libyan government on June 11, 1970. This date is now treated as a national holiday in Libya. Even as Gaddafi continued to represent Libya as a country without any alliances, and as he continued to oppose the spread of communism in Arab countries, he began to create ties to the Soviet Union and other Eastern European countries. During this time, Libya drastically increased the size of its army, from the 6,000-man force that existed prior to the revolution. It was also armed with armor and missiles that came from the Soviet Union. Gaddafi published his Green Book in 1975, outlining his ideals for what he was calling Islamic socialism. Although small companies were allowed to be maintained under private control, larger companies were controlled by the government. In addition, Gaddafi outlined a strict set of morals that included the prohibition of alcohol and gambling. The book was introduced into the school's curriculum as required reading for the students.
Green Book, so some eclectic Arabic, African, let's get together and let's have continental unity and comradeship as long as Libya is in the lead. Well, a lot of the African countries didn't like that part of it.
1977 brought more changes for the people of Libya. It was during this time that the government was changed from a republic to that of a jamahiriya. Jamahiriya is best described as a government by the masses. Libyans were challenged to become involved in the operation of the government and to establish committees to run government organizations themselves. The General People's Congress, GPC, was at the top of all various committees, with Gaddafi as the Secretary General. No longer the Libyan Arab Republic, the new name chosen by the GPC was reflective of this new attitude. Now called the Great Socialist People's Libyan Arab Jamahiriya, after 2 years, Gaddafi relinquished his title as the Secretary General of the GPC and was known after just as leader or leader of the revolution. The GPC now maintained all legislative and executive authority. However, it designated Gaddafi to be the General Secretary and created a General Secretariat of the GPC. The General Secretariat consisted of members of the RCC that was no longer in existence, while Gaddafi, as the General Secretary, retained the position of primary decision-maker.
Rechanged the name to the Libyan Arab of Jamahira. I think that was more of a concession to try to show people, I am working with you. I think the reality, and this is where my own research comes in, is some of the liberalization processes that have happened in countries in the Middle East and in North Africa are to basically to appease the people and give them some sense that I'm expanding the government to include your issues and your grievances, but the reality is decision is still made from the top.
Gaddafi continued to use Nasser as inspiration, and he became obsessed with unifying all of the Arab states into one nation. He also supported the idea of a union of Islamic countries and its people, called Pan-Islamism. After Nasser died in 1970, Gaddafi attempted to merge Libya, Egypt, and Syria in 1972 in an attempt to create a pan-Arab state called the Federation of Arab Republics. This attempt failed due to the inability of the countries involved to come to an agreement. In 1974, Gaddafi tried again with Tunisia. This agreement between the two countries failed also because of the differences between the two countries that would eventually make them enemies.
If the idea of an overarching government of the Middle East came to pass, then the question would arise, what would be the nature of that government? How would fundamentalist Islam participate in such a government? Would it participate? The idea of popular participation in government is a much more amelioratory kind of element in Libyan society. It would be a much more peaceful, a much safer place for the rest of the world, but it's sort of hard to see that happening if you have a unified government run by one individual, by one group of individuals, overarching all of the Middle East. It's hard to imagine how that could be put together.
I think it's really hard to tell if he was sincere about wanting such a pan-Middle Eastern union. And really, pan-anything is kind of difficult. It's a difficult proposition. And particularly a pan-Middle Eastern union when there's so much fracture between nations.
Gaddafi sees Libya as a leader of Africa, black Africa.
Okay.
In a part of the world where the North Africans haven't really been thinking about pan-continental unity on the African continent. They're trying to build their countries. He's always tried to bring Africa under his leadership, under the leadership of Libya. And it just hasn't worked because the Africans are suspicious of Arab nations.
Libya was involved in a dispute with a neighboring country, Chad, in 1983. The dispute centered around Gaddafi's refusal to recognize President Hissène Habre's legitimacy. Gaddafi lent military support to the opposition in an attempt to overthrow Habre. Military support from the French helped ensure that Habre remained in power. In addition to his desire to have Habre removed from office, an area called the Aouzou Strip that Libya had occupied in 1973 was also an issue. The conflict between Chad and Libya eventually reached a ceasefire accord in 1987. The issue of the Aouzou Strip was not dealt with in ceasefire. However, it was formally settled in 1994 when Libya was forced to withdraw from Chad based upon a judgment from the International Court of Justice that had been issued earlier that year. This war was a disaster for Gaddafi. He lost 1/10 of his army, and over $1.5 billion of military equipment was destroyed or captured. The Oujda Treaty was signed in 1984 with Morocco's Hassan II. The aim was to unite both countries with a focus on economical, cultural, and political cooperation. Gaddafi also used the treaty to end Morocco's support of a group called the National Front for the Salvation of Libya. This group is opposed to Gaddafi's continued rule in Libya. However, in 1986, Libya stated that Hassan II broke the treaty by committing an act of treason when he met with the Israeli Prime Minister, Shimon Peres, in Morocco. Gaddafi damaged the relationship that Libya had with Egypt when he became a strong supporter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, or PLO. In 1979, Egypt reached a peace agreement with Israel. As the relationship between Libya and Egypt deteriorated, Gaddafi pursued closer ties to the Soviet Union. The relationship became such that Libya was the first country outside the Soviet Union to receive supersonic MiG-25 combat fighters. As recently as 2009, Gaddafi expressed his continued desire for a united Arab. He was elected chairman for the 53-nation African Union. During his speech to assembled leaders, Gaddafi was quoted as saying, "I shall continue to insist that our sovereign countries work to achieve the United States of Africa." In the beginning stages of the Jamahiriya reform, there were many Libyans living in exile that opposed the reforms. The groups obviously did not have much of an impact upon the outcome of the reform, but Gaddafi warned those in opposition of the reforms to return home or to face liquidation. After this, many prominent Libyans were assassinated. A failed coup in 1975 led to the flight of the leader of the coup and many of those involved. In a move made to show that such opposition was not to be tolerated, the regime executed 22 of the officers that were accused to have taken part in the coup. Since then, there have been reports of other uprisings ending in violence and death due to a no-tolerance policy. Relations between the United States and Libya became especially strained in 1981, when Gaddafi talked about assassinating newly elected President Ronald Reagan.
We have sources that we are relying on and tasking to keep us informed, and we're acting on the information in the best way that we know how.
That same year, President Anwar Sadat, Egypt's president, was assassinated. Gaddafi felt that it was just punishment. In 1982, Gaddafi was quoted as saying, "It is the Libyan people's responsibility to liquidate such scums who are distorting Libya's image abroad." This quote was during a discussion regarding exiles from Libya. Between the years of 1980 and 1987, Gaddafi used his loyal followers to assassinate at least 25 people, according to Amnesty International. In 1980, a graduate student at Colorado State University, Faisal Zagalai, had an assassination attempt made upon his life that partially blinded him. He was later kidnapped and executed in 1990, just prior to receiving citizenship in the United States. The United Kingdom was another place that many Libyans attempted to seek asylum in. The United Kingdom actually broke off relations with Libya in 1984 after a policewoman and 10 anti-Gaddafi demonstrators was killed when shots were fired from the Libyan People's Bureau in London. Relations were not restored until 1999, after Libya actually accepted responsibility for the incident and paid compensation to the woman's family.
A female Bobby who was patrolling outside the embassy, which, the territorial state is supposed to have police around the embassy to protect the embassy. Well, someone in the Libyan embassy with a sniper rifle shot this British Bobby, just killed her walking along the street. The British could not go into the Libyan embassy under international agreements about diplomatic immunity, but they responded by telling the entire Libyan embassy that they were persona non grata and had to leave. So they emptied the Libyan embassy, and there was no functioning Libyan embassy in London for a very long time. But there was a murder, just sort of a random murder, somebody doing target practice on a British Bobby.
Libya also continues to offer rewards for killing critics, including $1 million for Libyan-British journalist Ashur Shamis.
Well, like many dictatorships and many oppressive regimes, those that oppose the leader, those that oppose Gaddafi, in the case of Libya, are executed or a price is put on their heads. I think it's one of the most brutal forms of leadership, obviously, available. No room for dissent, no room for growth of the country, and obviously a very violent reaction to those that do speak out.
In addition to his strong-arm tactics in his own country and against his own countrymen, Gaddafi has also set about to inspire terror throughout the world. His career as a terrorist began early into his takeover of Libya, beginning with France when they opposed Libyan occupation of Chad in 1971. From there, he sent out a call in June of 1972 to any Arab that wanted to join a Palestinian terrorist group to register at any Libyan embassy. He promised that those signing up would receive adequate training for combat and financial support. Later that same year, he praised the Japanese Red Army for the Lod Airport massacre and demanded that Palestinian terrorists do such similar acts. The massacre that occurred in Munich at the 1972 Olympic Games, carried out by the Black September movement, was supposedly heavily financed by Gaddafi. Gaddafi also supported the Irish Republican Army, and in 1973, the Irish Naval Service boarded the vessel Claudia that carried Soviet arms from Libya to the IRA. Later, in 1976, after a series of terrorist attacks, Gaddafi was quoted as saying, "The bombs which are convulsing Britain and breaking its spirit are the bombs of the Libyan people. We have sent them to the Irish revolutionaries so that the British will pay the price for their past deeds." Gaddafi began working with a group called the Nation of Islam. Located in Chicago, this group received large amounts of money from Gaddafi. Libya announced on their state television that the country was training suicide squads to attack American and European targets. Operation El Dorado Canyon was the United States' rebuttal against Gaddafi. On the 14th of April in 1986, the United States bombed air defenses, army bases, and airfields. Although failing to kill Gaddafi himself, he lost numerous military officers. In an attempt to spin the situation to make him look as good as possible, Gaddafi began a propaganda campaign that included telling people how his adopted daughter was killed in the attacks, along with the rest of the victims that had all been civilians. Many Western papers believed this and reported the information as fact. The Philippines had also felt Gaddafi's influence and suffered for it. There are two Islamic organizations in the Philippines, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front and the Abu Sayyaf. Each has attempted to achieve the goal of establishing a separate Islamic state through terrorist attacks. Each has received some form of support from Libya. For example, in 2002, Gaddafi paid a ransom of reportedly tens of millions of dollars to the Abu Sayyaf group to release a number of tourists that had been kidnapped. Although presented as an act of goodwill to the world, he inevitably funneled millions of dollars into a terrorist group that enabled it to grow stronger.
The history of the individual acts that Gaddafi's created is a sort of an amazing one. I guess it was about 1986. He was purported to be responsible for the bombing of a disco in Berlin that was frequented by U.S. soldiers, and as a result of that bombing, they found communications by Libyan agents with regard to this disco and the bombing that led the U.S. government to believe that he was responsible, and that's what led President Reagan to bomb Tripoli the first time.
That's one of the reasons why the United States has been reluctant to work with Gaddafi, even when he made amends by giving, millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars to the survivors of the various terrorist acts that he perpetrated.
I think his terrorism was more to achieve his goals of what he wanted to do. And this is basically to create a pan-Arab Islamic nation, which is why he would support the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Movement. And then, of course, when they signed peace treaties, and they said, no, sorry, I'm not going to do it. So I think he was more self-serving in his terrorist activities and maybe to isolate the United States.
When you see yourself surrounded, trying to place myself in the position of someone like Gaddafi, if I see myself surrounded by all of these powerful states with large military forces, with large capabilities to conduct attacks, I would find ways that would allow me to maximize my ability to influence them. Asymmetric warfare. The one thing that I can do against the big guys is conduct small terrorist attacks. And to demonstrate to people in his country that he has power, he commits these pinpricks.
In spite of his previous years supporting just about any terrorist group, recently, Gaddafi has made an effort to improve his image in the West. He was one of the first and most supportive during the attacks against the United States by Al-Qaeda on 9/11. In fact, he was one of the most supportive Muslim leaders and openly denounced the attacks immediately.
I know his terrorist campaigns were more because they were, at the time period, they were more against the system. I know that Osama bin Laden is someone that he did not like. He did not like Al-Qaeda. He was actually the first country to issue an international warrant against Al-Qaeda.
In 2003, Gaddafi proclaimed that he had an active weapons of mass destruction program. He allowed international inspectors into Libya to evaluate and dismantle the program.
There was fair evidence that he was constructing underground nuclear research facilities so that he could develop nuclear weapons. And there was some talk, I can't remember exactly when it was, but there was some talk about a military attack on the site of his nuclear research. And that was the point at which he rejected all, he publicly denounced all movement toward nuclear weapons and all research into nuclear weapons, and that's when he sort of rehabilitated himself.
There have been many who questioned his motives for doing this. The ideas have ranged from fear for his own government to continuing to develop better relations with the West in order to get sanctions removed. Apparently, this offer had been made at least 4 years prior to inspectors actually going into Libya. The inspectors did find several tons of chemical weapons, as well as an active nuclear weapons program. Libya improved its relationship with those countries monitoring it, to the extent that an agreement was reached with France in 2006 to assist Libya in developing a nuclear power program. In 2009, Abdel Basset al-Megrahi was released from a Scottish prison on the grounds of compassionate release, as it had been determined he was dying of cancer and would not live long. This release created a furor that reverberated throughout the world.
I was appalled. I felt sick to my stomach when I heard about it. This man was convicted of the largest mass murder on British soil, and he was allowed to go free.
The reason for this international outcry was because 21 years ago, Abdel Basset Ali Mohammed El-Megrahi and Al-Amin Khalifa Fahima were responsible for taking 270 lives 4 days before Christmas. On December 21, 1988, they set a bomb on board Pan Am Flight 103. The plane exploded over Lockerbie, Scotland, killing not only all 259 people on the flight, but 11 people on the ground. Although there were people from 21 different countries on board the plane, 179 of the victims were American citizens. For years after this tragic incident, Libya continued to protect the two gentlemen accused of setting the bomb that blew up Flight 103. Libya refused to turn them over to be tried in court. Because of this refusal, the UN imposed sanctions in 1992 that were not to be lifted until the requirements were fulfilled. This led to political and economic isolation for Libya for most of the 90s. These sanctions reduced airline connections with the rest of the world, reduced diplomatic ties, and prohibited the sale of military equipment. In addition, sanctions were also placed upon their oil industry. The sale of refinery or pipeline equipment was prohibited, leading to a decline in their refining ability. Libya's foreign assets were also frozen. In 1999, the two defendants were handed over to be tried in the Netherlands under Scottish law. Abdel Basset El-Megrahi was found guilty and sentenced to prison in Scotland, while the second gentleman was found not guilty. Libya sent a letter to the United Nations in August of 2003, formally accepting responsibility for the actions of its citizens in the bombing. They also agreed to pay up to $10 million each to the families of the 270 victims. Megrahi was found to be dying of prostate cancer, and the doctor treating him said that he had little time to live. Due to the lack of advanced treatment options in Libya, the doctor recommended that Megrahi be released for compassionate reasons to be allowed to spend his remaining days with his family. His release and subsequent return to Libya was met with disapproval throughout the world. The fact that Gaddafi treated him as a hero upon his return to Libya further enraged the world.
He gets to go home and be with his family before he dies, and none of the people he killed had that luxury.
One of Gaddafi's greatest achievements has at this point in time cost at least $25 billion and has been paid for solely by Gaddafi without any loans from any other country or any assistance from another country. The Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System, NSAS, is basically an ocean underneath the Sahara and is in 4 countries: Chad, Egypt, Sudan, and Libya. It is water left over from when Africa was underwater thousands of years ago, and for this reason is called the world's largest fossil water system. Gaddafi has called the NSAS the 8th wonder of the world. Taking over 20 years to begin, the system now provides purified water for human consumption, development, and irrigation. Gaddafi has presented this project as his gift to the Third World.
Well, I know Gaddafi is really focused on the issue of water because it's a water deficient country. So is part of Egypt and Chad, and I believe part of Sudan. But I think for Gaddafi, it was about trying to obtain some kind of water source because you need it for your own development.
I believe Gaddafi definitely sees the NSAS as a means for Libya to gain even more power, or for himself to gain more power, using that, because he senses, like anyone that's observing the problems in the world, the imminent water shortage that's going to happen and that is happening throughout the world.
This is where there's this discrepancy. Gaddafi has put a lot of his own money and time into this aquifer system. He's given different numbers about how much water is out there. He gave a statistic of that the water will last 4,625 years. And scholars and specialists are arguing that it's actually 60 years. And right now I think it's like 60.5 million cubic meters of water that's used a day. And so if you have 60 years, the question becomes this is a viable issue for Gaddafi, for all of the nations. You know, water is going to be a resource, much like oil, that is going to be fought over. You don't have access to water, you don't have access to agricultural development, you don't have access to day-to-day needs. So water is going to be a huge issue for a lot of countries that are particularly landlocked or don't have an access of resource. That's why you see development along the Nile so coveted, because that's where the water resources is, where it's at, and that's where you see agricultural. But you also see development in terms of modernization, and so you have that contrast. So I think for Gaddafi, the idea that this aquifer represents the end-all, be-all for his needs is a little bit more wishful thinking.
Another project that Gaddafi is very passionate about is the Libyan National Telescope project, which cost over $14 million and is an expression of Gaddafi's love of astronomy. A robotic telescope, a little over 6.5 feet, is being built by France's REOSC, a division of the SAGEM group. The site currently being considered is near Kufra. The plans include an air-conditioned building with a system of weather stations. This project, when completed, will be North Africa's largest astronomical observatory. Gaddafi has 2 wives and 8 biological children, only one of whom is female. His first wife is in disfavor. His second wife was Safia Farkash. Gaddafi has also adopted 2 children, Hannah and Milad. His eldest son, Muammar El-Qaddafi, was born to his first wife. He runs the Libyan Olympic Committee. In addition, he is the chairman of the General Post and Telecom Company that owns and operates cell phone and satellite services in Libya. He has also been considered as a possible successor for his father as ruler of Libya. The rest of his children are with Safia. Saif al-Islam Muammar El-Qaddafi was born in 1972. He has worked as an architect and as a politician in his father's government. At one point, Saif became vocal about criticizing his father's government. Saif left the country to reportedly work in the banking industry. He did not stay away long and returned to Libya to take up work teaching children how to help the environment by cleaning up parts of Libya. Al-Saeed Al-Gaddafi is the 3rd son, and he is married to the daughter of a commander in the military. Saeed played for various professional football teams and ran the Libyan Football Federation. Al-Mutatsim Billah Al-Gaddafi is Gaddafi's 4th son, and he was a lieutenant colonel in the Libyan army. He later served in another capacity as Libya's National Security Advisor, where he was in charge of the National Security Council. Hannibal Muammar El-Qaddafi is his fifth son and formerly worked for the General National Maritime Transport Company, specializing in oil exports. He has a history of violence and has been arrested in numerous countries. His wife has also suffered physical damages in spite of no charges being pressed against him. Due to an incident with his wife in Switzerland, Libya boycotted Swiss products, reduced the number of flights between their countries, removed diplomats from Switzerland, and forced Swiss companies in Libya to close their offices. 2 Swiss businessmen were not allowed to leave the country and were considered to be hostages for a time. Saif al-Arab al-Gaddafi is his sixth son. He was a military commander in the Libyan army during the uprising in 2011. However, he defected to the opposition and became a member of the Libyan People's Army. The seventh son is Khamis al-Gaddafi, who is a commander of the elite Khamis Brigade in the Libyan army. Khamis was involved in a month-long internship with a company based out of Los Angeles called AECOM. The company is a global engineering and design company that offered the internship with the assistance and knowledge of the State Department. Khamis toured the United States, meeting with various companies, universities, and defense contractors. The educational information was aimed to improve the quality of life for Libyans, to advance public infrastructure, quality housing, safe and efficient roads and bridges, and to help create jobs. Khamis left February 17th, where he joined with his brigade called the Khamis Brigade in a brutal suppression of rebel forces.
So Gaddafi's youngest son, Khamis, is fighting for Gaddafi's government in this uprising. He's left the United States to go fight in the military against the rebels.
His only daughter is Aisha al-Gaddafi, who is a lawyer. She was part of the defense team for the former Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein. Aisha married Gaddafi's cousin. When Gaddafi overthrew King Idris in 1969, one of the major complaints was that all the wealth coming into the country from the oil remained in control of the royal family. In spite of this, Gaddafi has not changed that policy. Although there has been a significant amount of money coming into Libya from their oil, the majority is spent on increasing Gaddafi's wealth, supporting the military, purchasing weapons, and supporting a campaign of terror throughout the world. Inspired by recent uprisings in various other Middle Eastern countries such as Tunisia and Egypt, the latest and most serious uprising against Gaddafi's rule came in February of 2011. The seeds of revolt began in January because of delays in building homes and political corruption. Protesters in Darna, Benghazi, Banja Walid, and other cities across Libya broke into and began living in housing that was being built by the government. The response of the government was to invest $24 billion into a fund to provide housing.
From Gaddafi's perspective, his notion of the legality of how he has run his government is bulletproof. He thinks that he has chosen what is the best form of government for Libyan people. But if you take the larger international perspective of human rights, the fundamental idea of self-determination and popular participation and democratic participation in government has become a fairly standard idea. It may sound to Americans like an American idea, but it's a widely respected idea that's included in lots of international agreements stating the rules about international human rights. To the extent that Gaddafi is preventing his own people from participating in the governance of Libya, then Gaddafi is acting in a manner that is entirely inconsistent with international norms and rules with regard to human rights.
For the first time ever, the internet was used as a tool to unite Libyans. Jamal al-Hajji called up people to demonstrate for support of greater freedoms in Libya. Arrested on February 1st, he was charged on the 3rd with hitting someone with his car. Amnesty International claimed that his arrest was solely because he called for demonstrations. Early in February, Gaddafi met with many groups warning against demonstrations and informing them they would be held responsible for any chaos that occurred in Libya. The evening of February 15, 2011, brought between 500 and 600 protesters chanting in front of police headquarters. 38 people were injured due to the violence used by the police to break up the protesters. Once again, another man was arrested. This time it was a novelist. Idris al-Mazmari, after giving an interview with the newspaper Al Jazeera with information regarding the police reaction to the protesters. In spite of this, the protests continued. Police and security buildings were set on fire in Al-Baida and Az-Zintan, with protesters calling for Gaddafi to be removed from power. Protests continued across Libya the following day, leading to 4 deaths and 3 injuries. In spite of the violence used in an attempt to bring the protesters under control, they persevered.
Basically what inspired the current uprising in Libya was the uprising of neighboring countries, Tunisia and Egypt, and the people of Libya saw this happening and said, if they can do it, why can't we, essentially? We don't have to put up with this. We don't have to put up with this violence and oppression, and, you know, we're going to be liberated like our neighbors.
On February 27th, the National Transition Council was created in Benghazi to be the political face of the revolution. They have declared themselves to be the sole representatives of Libya and have created an interim government. The council refers to Libya as the Libyan Republic. The violence used by Gaddafi and his supporters against the protesters has drawn an international outcry. A woman has gone public with her treatment at the hands of Gaddafi supporters. She was kidnapped and held for days, where she was gang raped and beaten. There are reports of Gaddafi's troops using civilian areas to house military weapons so that they are not destroyed by airstrikes. The protesters were losing ground to Gaddafi's troops, and it was feared that he would remain in power. Because of this, on March 17th, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution to enforce a no-fly zone over Libya. The UN also authorized airstrikes against Libyan ground troops and any warships posing threats to civilians. In addition, aircraft carriers from the United States arrived off the coast to provide support and to fire Tomahawk cruise missiles against Libya.
If Gaddafi goes, it's going to be because he reaches a stalemate, he decides to settle and leave himself, or by the opposition actually being militarily victorious. But there's no justification for anybody else to actually go in and take Gaddafi out.
The situation in Libya is incredibly unique. First, it's the first time that the UN Security Council has authorized the use of force on humanitarian and human rights grounds only. So there was no threat to international peace and security. Gaddafi was not involved in an act of aggression. This was not a peacekeeping force. This is a literal use of force, all necessary measures to protect the civilian population of Libya, allowing not only a no-fly zone, but also a no-drive zone, as they call it.
This revolution will have to be decided by the Libyan people.
Okay.
In as far as the West and the United States can help, in terms of, you know, medical aids, food, some small weapons, some training. But when you start talking about any other kind of involvement by the United States, I think Britain and France are trying to send advisors in to advise these rebels and the like. And we've had our people on the ground trying to see what's going on, but we have our hands full in other parts of the Middle East.
I mean, I think oil is a huge issue. I don't know to the quality of Libya's oil, but I do know oil is a huge factor. I mean, if you're dealing with all of the economies, every economy needs oil. I don't know many economies that are actually branching on other alternative fuels. I know we've done with jojoba oil, we've done with, you know, corn, ethanol, but the reality is we don't have the infrastructure yet. And as long as countries, and not just the United States, every industrialized and developing country that is aspiring to be industrialized, as long as they rely on oil, the Middle East is always going to be an area of great conflict and potential tensions between nations, because it's a tool.
I think that ultimately, we're seeing the Gaddafi regime in Libya being treated exceptionally, largely because of its political situation, having to do with its isolation, its relationship to energy markets, and its geographic location and proximity to Europe, more than anything having to do with the actual nature of the regime, distinguishing it from other regimes in the region, whether by comparison to atrocities taking place in Africa, or whether by comparison to democratic uprisings in the rest of the Arab world.
With the military actions against Libya from the United Nations and the United States, it is apparent that Gaddafi can no longer be allowed to remain in control. Throughout his long reign as ruler of Libya, Gaddafi has shown time and again that he does not allow anyone to show disobedience or to speak out against him without severe repercussions. If Gaddafi is allowed to remain in power after the show of force from the United States and those countries involved with the United Nations and others providing aid, he will retaliate. This will add to the ongoing war that is already being fought against Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and other Muslim extremists. With his strong beliefs of Arab unity, this could be dangerous indeed. It is not outside the realm of possibility that Gaddafi would try to combine forces with these other groups. Under a more cohesive leadership, the threat posed by these terrorists would be even greater.